Welcome. If you're a woman who has a sense that there's more out there for you, you're in the right place. I'm Whitney Baker, host of the Electric Ideas podcast. Somewhere along the line of work and kids, life carried on, but I lost track of my truth. I'm on a reflective journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. Each week, I interview a woman who is lighting her own path and offering others hope. Before our conversation ends, we'll share a reflective question for you to explore. Sometimes all we need is a jolt, a fresh idea, an aha moment that connects us to a sense of possibility. This, my friends, is what I call an electric idea. Welcome back to Electric Ideas. I'm your host, Whitney Baker. Today, we are diving into a conversation that I am super passionate about. I've done a ton of research and reading on this topic in my own life, and that is the topic of our relationship with time and how we can live in a way where it feels like what matters most and our priorities and our values are actually showing up on our calendar and in our day-to-day, instead of feeling like we're being driven by our to-do lists and what just kind of ends up there by default based on other people's needs and demands of our time and energy. What I've found with working with women who are in the messy middle of busy motherhood is that you don't have to wait for a massive reset. That often small approaches to your rhythms for your day-to-day can make a big difference. For example, shifting when you do mental work versus physical work, or building in margins for your day. These little things can help you open up time for creativity and rest and connection. I'm so excited to have Bridget Payne Watson join me today. Bridget is an editor, writer, and artist, and after working in publishing for more than 20 years, she now works as a freelance editor and creative consultant with authors, artists, and publishers. I really admire Bridget because she is a mom with a big job who also has made space to write 8 books, including How Time is on Your Side, which is the book we are diving into today. This is such a meaningful conversation for anyone who feels a lot of stress around time and feels like they're treating time almost as an enemy and something that is constantly scarce. Bridget's teachings and tools from her book really help us view time as something we can work with, so you feel kind of a sense of opening and possibility rather than this constant pressure. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a much more free way to live. I know this conversation is going to spark fresh thinking and that you're going to have tons of awesome takeaways, so let's get into it. Hi, Bridget. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited you're here to talk all things to do with how we change our relationship with time. I want to start out because one compelling part of your book that I liked is you did some research and had some thought-provoking things to say around how modern day factors are influencing women, especially moms, kind of feeling miserable about being constantly time crunched and in that scarcity mode. So what did you find?
A lot of that time crunch goes back to more women, middle-class women, entering the workforce in the, sort of second wave feminism, 70s, 80s, which was a huge, huge demographic shift of how we all mostly lived. Never really cracked the code, did anything as a society about childcare. We almost did. There was almost universal childcare, preschool at a federal level, like the way we have public education. We almost had public childcare. It was in Congress, didn't happen. So in the absence of something like that, everyone has had to just sort of, build the plane while flying it ever since to figure out, like, what are you going to do with the kids if you've got 2 working parents? So it has ever since been a scramble, basically, to be like figuring out what that looks like, because we do still also end up often in traditional gender roles in families, with more of that falling to the mother than the father, as much as we may not want it to. People are effectively having 2 full-time jobs, right? They have a job outside the home and then they have a job inside the home. And so it does really result in this time crunch of trying to do 2 things at once, more than 2 things in many cases, because of course there are a lot of other things that people want to do as well. They want to take care of other members of their family. They want to exercise their creativity. They want to be involved in their communities and activism, or, they want to cook. They want to sing. They want to, whatever it is, people have many interests in many parts of themselves they want to express. So they're trying to do many, many things. Then, of course, things have sped up so much in the 21st century as well in terms of technology. We all walk around with computers in our pocket all day long. A lot of factors have gone into this. But at root, it kind of really is a feminist issue in a lot of ways, which can make it seem like it's only an issue for women, but it's really an issue for everybody because everybody is scrambling to figure out what to do with these kids. Because school
Yeah.
gets out at 3 and work goes till 6. It's a real problem.
It's
And
kind
it
of this
results in
perfect
a lot of
storm. Mm.
rushing around, a lot of patched together solutions, because what you do with a 3-year-old is very different than what you do with a 7-year-old or what you do with a 15-year-old. As soon as a family gets into one pretty good groove of like, okay, well, this is what we're doing, a few years go by and it probably changes. So it's not like any one solution is going to last very long either. So,
Yes, that it's a lot of influx, or you just got it settled in and now somebody changed or someone needs change. I'm sure everybody listening can relate to that. What's bubbling up for me as you're talking is if we pull back a little bit, it's like this perfect storm of, yes, statistics bear out that whether we like it or not, moms have a bigger mental load. It's true. We still carry, regardless of what else we're doing. We do a lot more of the errands and the scheduling and the carpooling and all of that. And then we've got the accessibility, which I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like I've been getting so many emails during this back to school transition time where it's just like, whoa. But then also something you talked about in your book was just kind of this entire concept where this is where we shift into like, yeah, I want to acknowledge the truth about how full the lives of women are and moms. But then you shift into a little bit of how even this idea of being busy has changed. You talked a little bit about how, I'm paraphrasing here, but in the 18th century, busy kind of meant being happily occupied. And in some ways, it's kind of shifted to this, what you call a sick badge of honor, and it can almost just turn into something totally different. Can you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, the meaning of the word has actually changed. Like that it used to mean just that you had stuff to do, that it was pretty much a neutral to positive term. Like, oh, I'm busy meant, yeah, I've got stuff going on and it feels good. Like I'm not bored, basically. And I don't think anyone means that when they say that anymore. If not the literal denotation, the connotation of the word has definitely changed. When you say you're busy, on the surface, you mean, oh God, I'm so busy. I'm overwhelmed. I feel terrible. But you're also, it's kind of a weird, humble brag, sick brag of like, oh, I must be so important because I'm so busy. I must be so vital to the system that I'm a part of, whether that's a family system or a work system. Like they couldn't get by without me because I'm so busy. I'm so overwhelmed. That shows how vital I am to whatever network and system I'm a part of. The minute I step away, they would all flounder without me. And I don't think anyone is conscious of like that. No one would say that out loud, but we sort of own our busyness as, like I was saying, like a sick badge of honor. Like, well, I feel miserable, but at least that shows me some like weird sense of my own worth and value. And I do think that this is something that maybe, and this is entirely anecdotal, I don't have research on this, but I do think that this is something that may be shifting a little bit in the culture now. I was telling you before we got on the air that I wrote this book and it was published in January of 2020. So I was promoting it and then the world, went off a cliff. So it's a pre-pandemic book. And it was very interesting to have written a book about no one having enough time. If you cast your mind back to 2019, 2020, this problem of people feeling overwhelmed, like they were burning the candle at both ends, I think was at its absolute height in like 2019 when I was coming out with this book. I think it's still true. I think people absolutely still feel this way, but I think we didn't in April of 2020. I think everybody had way too much time on there. Let's bake some sourdough bread, like nobody had anything to do for a minute there. And coming out of that time, I think there were some real moments of questioning, like, why was I living my life that way? Why did I do that to myself? I mean, I think we've also, a lot of us picked those habits right back up, but there is more conversations around mental load, certainly in the last 5 years, more conversations around burnout. Even some of the sort of silly things that people talk about, like quiet quitting and like some of these like buzzwords that are kind of dumb that you hear and that it's a news story for 5 minutes and then it goes away. But a lot of them do have to do with people questioning the way we've been living our lives and the way people have been freaking out or using time or not using time or panicking about how much they have to do, which are real things to panic about. Don't get me wrong, like it's legit. But those kinds of topics, I think, are shifting a bit in people's minds of like, what does busyness mean? Does it have to be this way?
Not to take us back to a time that was, so hard for so many people, but during pandemic times, I think that it forced a lot of women to slow down. And it's a gift we don't give ourselves that often. And I think that for a lot of people, they get in such a rat race of overscheduling and overcommitting and saying yes, because they think that that's going to be what makes their life full. But when it's not intentional, that doesn't necessarily hold true, which I know we can talk about with prioritization. So I feel like some women probably had this sense like, oh my gosh, I'm kind of creating my own worst nightmare in my own life by committing to all this stuff that is draining.
Right. And that there are choices to be made. It can be disingenuous to say you always have a choice because you don't always have a choice. There are plenty of things we all have to do every day that you don't really have a choice about. You have to go to work. You have to, put a roof over your head. You have to do a lot of things that you got to take care of your kids. You got to, whatever it is. But there are a lot of micro choices to be made about how we choose to execute certain things. Like you're saying, what we prioritize. We can put a lot of pressure on ourselves to do certain things in certain ways. Maybe it's the way we grew up doing it. Maybe it's the way other people are doing it. Maybe, some idea we've got in our head, whatever, social media, whatever it is. You get a lot of notions that you've received from this or that place. But at the end of the day, it is up to you how you execute the obligations and priorities that you have in your life. And it's funny, I sometimes say that I write self-help books that have no actual advice in them, that all the advice is just you need to figure out what works best for you and do what works for you yourself and not anyone else's. I can't tell you what your actual best way to, do you bake for the bake sale because you love baking, or do you go get Safeway brownies because who has the time for that? Like I can't tell you. I don't know. You only know what is best for you. Like I have no idea. I don't want to bake for a bake sale, but that's me, which is a minor example. But like it's a analogy for a lot of other things where we choose to put our energy.
And what the reason behind things are,
Exactly.
and if
Yeah.
it's like a genuine for you, then go for it. I know exactly what you mean because I feel like connecting with yourself and being honest about why you're saying yes for something or why you're doing something is a big part of prioritization for me. I want to circle back. Despite where we are now, many years later, I still feel in a lot of communities I engage with women that I'm busy, I'm drowning, I'm overwhelmed, I'm burnout is still very common. And a quote by Ruth Messenger from your book really stuck with me. I'm going to read it. It says, "We cannot retreat to the convenience of being overwhelmed." And based on what we're talking about, I definitely don't want to discount the real demands. Somebody has to do the laundry. We want to feed our kids well, all the things. But I really want to dig into this a little bit because it's almost like you were making a point that if we are just like, well, I'm busy, I'm overwhelmed, it was as if we're helpless. And it's kind of a convenient excuse for not showing up for ourselves and for maybe some other things that are kind of a big deal and our area of contribution. Can you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, I've always really loved that quote. I do think it's a little bit tough love, but I do think it is a real, sort of like bomb of truth that kind of drops into your head when you think about that quote. It's like nobody thinks of being overwhelmed as convenient. It's you think, why is she calling it convenient? That's the most inconvenient thing in my life. It's how overwhelmed I feel. It's a very counterintuitive way of putting it. But once you have declared yourself officially overwhelmed, conveniently, you don't have to try, really. You don't have to make any really tough sort of triage decisions about like, well, I'm going to do this instead of that. I'm going to prioritize this over that. You can just sort of retreat into, well, everything is going to sort of not be my call anymore. I'm just overwhelmed. I just sort of have to stumble along helpless, like you
Yeah.
said. I mean, and that sounds like I'm putting a really harsh judgment on people because I mean, I felt that way. We've all felt that way. I'm not, trying to like call anyone out here. I don't think that's helpful or accurate, honestly. I think it's a really human instinct to get overwhelmed and then sort of throw up our hands. But I think what she's pointing out is there is also a sort of safety and almost relaxation, avoidance of stress response in that, where you're like keeping yourself away from having to maybe make hard decisions. Where if there are things you really want to be doing, but that are hard or scary or challenging, you're not sure how to make the time for them, you're not sure how people around you are going to respond to them, if they don't feel like the easiest choices. This kind of gives you a get out of jail free card or an end run around having to do those things because you're like, oh, well, I'm overwhelmed, I'm busy, I can't do them anyway.
Yeah.
And again, it's sort of that sick badge of courage thing. It's sort of a sick convenience. It's not healthy. It's not useful in the long run.
Yeah, it's nuanced, right? All of this stuff is because we've all had those seasons in our life where there's something major or a transition or little kids or whatever. And we want to greet all of this work with so much self compassion. And that's true. But I think that women hide out in their busyness sometimes. And then it
I mean,
becomes disempowering.
and that's the other thing I was thinking about when you and I were talking about like what we were going to talk about today. One of
Yeah.
the things we were talking about was, this idea of specifically around motherhood and parenthood and like how do you make time for the things you want to do when you have children, like for creativity or for other, things that are important in your life. And that's just a topic that comes up a lot. It's a topic that people tend to ask artists who are women, how do you do it with your children? It can be kind of sexist because nobody asks men that. At the same time, we know why that question is getting asked. And I was thinking about it. I was thinking, like, do I have any useful insights to offer, women in that situation? Like, the one that I might have is a certain amount of self compassion and grace. And your comment about seasons is what made me just think of it, is that it changes. It's a cliche to say, like, what is it? The days are long, but the years are short. But it is a cliche because it's true. Cliches become cliches for a reason. And that the passage of time is a little bit what we're saying about, when you're trying to take care of small children, the after school needs of a 3-year-old are very different than the after school needs of an 8-year-old or whatever. But the amount of time you have to devote to your own practice, be that a creative practice, be that a social, community, something you want to do in your community, whatever it is you're trying to make time for, when you have a small child, when you have a baby or a toddler, yeah, you may not have the time. You are glued to that kid. Trying to beat yourself up because you don't have the time when you have a little kid in the house. And it feels like it will always be that way. It feels like, oh, I'm a parent. I have children now. I can't make time to do these things. I'm overwhelmed. And it doesn't feel like that's ever going to change. But the reality is that in a few years, you're not going to have a tiny child in the house anymore. You're going to have a big child in the house because kids grow and they grow really fast, actually. And suddenly you've got a teenager. And then, oh, wow, you do have the time. Time passes and what it means to be a parent in terms of how much mental load it actually takes. And that feels like it will never change, but it actually changes so remarkably fast. And if you talk to anyone with older kids, that's what they will tell you is like, oh, I feel like they were two the other day. And now they're not. It changed. And now I do have the time. Nothing is forever. No state of how we feel about the proportions of how we spend our days is static, especially if we're living with little people whose whole purpose is to change very, very rapidly. Their lives are changing, which means our lives are going to be changing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that what has worked well for me, and I know you have some mindset and practical tools around this that we can talk about from the book, is figure out your priorities. Like you said, maybe it's creative pursuit, maybe it's something in your community, maybe it's your self care, something like that. But instead of having this rigid approach where it's all or nothing, or you're going to be delusional and think that all of a sudden you have all this time, it takes a long time before you feel that way on the motherhood journey. I think practicing making space in the messy reality of where you are in your motherhood journey has been very effective because it composites, for one thing. It adds up. And
Yeah.
also just building that muscle so that as your kids get older and you have more pockets of time, you know what to do. You're not like,
Yeah.
oh my God, running around with like a chicken with your head cut off, not showing up for your priorities. So for the woman who is like, yeah, that sounds good. Where do I start? What would you suggest?
This was one of my favorite parts in writing that book is that I interviewed a lot of people and talked to them about how they made time for things that were important to them. It was all different kinds of things. It was creative work, art, community work, creative, hobbies, all kinds of different stuff. And this is that same thing again. It's like what works for one person isn't going to work for another, and you have to find what works for you. But so many different kinds of strategies that people used both just by themselves and with their partners. There was a family that did sort of this tag team thing where like she got up early and he stayed up late, and they kind of worked out different sort of shifts with the childcare. So all different kinds of strategies and things that would very clearly not work for someone else. It's like works for one person but doesn't work for another. And that's why I wanted to include a lot in the book, because I was like, oh, someone is going to read through these, like, I forget, I think there's like 36 or something, like interviews in here, like little short excerpts, and they're going to throw 80% of them in the trash can. They're going to be like, well, this wouldn't work for me, this wouldn't work for you, this wouldn't work for me. But if they find even just like a handful that are interesting to them, that they're like, oh, I never thought of that and maybe I could do that, then that's it. That's all you need. It's like just a couple of ideas, to get you started.
Yeah.
Probably my favorite one in the whole book is a woman who wrote 2 children's picture books, which were published. She's an author. And her first 2 books she wrote when her kid was really little. And she wrote them on the New York subway on her phone. And her commute wasn't even that long. She walked her kid to school, dropped him off at his like preschool, and then took the subway from his school to her office, which was, I don't know, I think it was like 15 minutes or something on the subway.
Yeah.
And every day, every morning, that was like pretty much her only alone time, because she had, a little preschool kid. And she would sit there on the subway typing in her notes app on her phone, working on
Yeah.
this, manuscript for this children's book. But just like that little 15 minutes a day on the subway with the phone, it's not how people picture an author. It's not how people picture someone writing a book. They think, oh, you have to have your desk, you have to have quiet. That idea of 15 minutes a day for a year adds up to, I don't know, I can't do that math, but a bunch of hours. A bunch of hours she would not have had if she hadn't have done that. And it's like you said, it's cumulative. At the end of the year, she had this chunk of time that she would not have had otherwise. It's interesting. I'm always a little hesitant when I tell that story, because I don't want to ever promote the idea that we have to cram productivity into every single minute of the day. There should be downtime. There should be rest. There should be moments of blankly staring out the window and watching the world go by. There should be naps. There should be, there should be plenty of downtime. But I do think that there are these pockets of time that are currently not useful, restful, fallow time, which I would not take away, but they're just sort of lying around uselessly. Like, I don't think she was like getting anything valuable out of her commute before she started doing this.
I was thinking the same thing. I actually don't even like the word productivity anymore, because it
Mhm.
just has this kind of masculine connotation. And I know you tread lightly with how you talk about it, but I fully agree. It's not that we're asking women to be these productive monsters who like, oh, you got 15 minutes, like cram in, like that is not the energy. I do feel like, and I can speak to this from personal experience, when you have a desire or a creative calling or like a sense that you like would have more energy if you were doing that one thing that makes you feel good and you keep not doing it, it can create a lot of like dissonance and anxiety. That doesn't feel good. So I feel like you said there's a difference between laying on your couch and scrolling Instagram and just like being mindless and intentional, mindful, restorative rest in whatever format that comes for you. But also being honest that the not doing the thing is causing more chaos and havoc in my soul than the doing of the thing, even if it's 15 minutes a day.
Right. And I think the thing that helps sometimes for people to think this stuff through is to sort of reframe their relationship with like vice and virtue a little bit. This
Mm.
isn't in the book, but it's something I've been thinking about more recently, where I have some stories in the book of people who had to get pretty creative to figure out how to fit like exercise routines into their day. Like there was a friend of mine who I interviewed who was a teacher, who she got off school at the same time as her kids. So she was with them, and she really was feeling like the lack of any kind of like exercise routine in her life. She found a exercise like boot camp kind of class that was in the park, and she basically took her kids to the park. They would just like hang around in the park. I think they were doing some homework on the grass and like playing in the playground and whatever, while she was over in a different part of the park doing this exercise class outdoors. And she was really, really happy with this routine. And nobody would say, We're being too, productivity minded, da 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 da, because everyone agrees that like exercise is virtuous. Of course, you should find a way to exercise. Like, of course, getting outside and getting your kids outside is virtuous. So, of course, this is a great story, and everyone's going to agree this is a great story because it sort of falls on the side of virtue. Whereas we question whether making time just for yourself to do just a thing that you feel like doing because you feel like doing it. Maybe that's a creative practice, or baking a great big cake, or lying on the couch and taking a real nap. Whatever the thing is that you, for some reason, think doesn't fall on the side of virtue, right? That feel a certain smidgen of guilt or dubiousness about, where you're like, well, maybe I should be being more productive. Maybe there's other things I should be doing for other people or for some task list somewhere, whatever. But this is where that question of prioritization does rear its head again, of like, only what the things that are really nagging at you, that are like, if I don't do this, I'm not going to feel as good. It's going to be bothering me that I never make the time for this. It's going to be continuing to prey upon me that this is something my life is missing, and I know it.
I want to make sure we make a little space to talk about procrastination. And you introduced Paul Graham's 3 categories of procrastination, which I thought was interesting. And there are just 3 variants of procrastination, which I'm going to read. So it's basically depending on what you do instead of working on something, you either work on nothing, A, B, you work on something less important, or C, you work on something more important. And you talk about how that C area is good procrastination. And it was refreshing because I totally agree with you that instead of getting into the nitty gritty that's always going to be coming at us like a water hose of like the school emails and all of that, if something's really a priority, it better show up on our calendar.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if you can talk into that whole idea of good procrastination a little bit more.
Yeah. This used to come up for me a lot when I worked in an office. Back when I was writing this, I worked in an office where I would get just inundated with email all the time, all day long. I would get like 100 emails a day at least. And I had a lot of meetings as well. So my calendar was often quite full. Times that I had to do work, whatever that meant, in between meetings were, an hour here, hour and a half there, a little chunk, chunk, chunk. And I could very easily spend all of those chunks of time just dealing with my inbox and basically nothing else. I had many days where I would do email and then a meeting and then email and then a meeting and then email and then a meeting and then go home. Like that was my day. And it wasn't that those emails weren't important. They were my job. Like they all had a purpose. But I had other things I needed to do. I had an actual job. I had book editor. I had books. I had edit manuscripts needed to edit. I had like ideating. I had big picture, overarching creative work I was supposed to be doing. And there was nobody to tell me to do it. I needed to self-direct myself to do that work. So I actually had to procrastinate email. All these people clamoring for a response. People who, if I didn't write them back, they would probably write me again and be like, hey, you haven't answered my email. I had to procrastinate that whole process in order to sit down and do whatever, my other bigger picture work. And that was hard for me as like a diligent, conscientious person who wanted to get back to folks when they wrote me. I would actually shut down my whole Outlook, whatever email program, and I would block it out of my calendar sometimes. I'd be like, okay, from when I first get in the morning, I'm not going to turn on email. I'm going to, 9 a.m. to my first meeting at, 10:30 or whatever. I'm going to do this other work for an hour and a half when I'm fresh, when I've had my coffee, and I would put it as an appointment on the calendar. And it really changed my life. I got so much more done. I was so much more efficient. I was so much more like satisfied with what I was doing rather than just reactive. And I think, it felt like, oh, I've figured out office work when I sort of solved that for myself. But I think it actually applies to a lot of other things if you just replace sort of email and projects with the small stuff and the big stuff of anything, whether it's domestic life, whether it's school, whether it's, whatever it is we're trying to tackle. I think it applies.
I absolutely think it applies. And I mean, I can speak to those practices from being in a former creative agency type life where like every email you received was on fire. And I didn't have the luxury at that time to just be like, I can't. I also think you set an expectation. I'm someone that it's not weird if a day and a half, maybe 2 days goes by and I don't respond. Sometimes I'll scan, and if it's not immediate, there's only a small amount of time I'm willing to spend on email every day. And that means that a ball might drop once in a while, but I'm usually, it's a practice. It's not perfection, but it's because I'm getting the things that I say are my priority, and I'm doing those in the morning when I feel good. Otherwise, I know whether it's work, creative projects, motherhood, whatever, it's not like our to-do list just all of a sudden is zero. So, unless you make space for your priorities, there's always going to be the little things that you could just like chip away at. And this kind of comes full circle back to that busyness mode. Like, no, I guess I'll just do this. Oh, where'd my day go?
And like, there's so many tactics and like small practices of figuring out, like, yeah, a lot of that little stuff does have to get done eventually at some point, but figuring out when in the day do you do it? When in the week do you do it? Do you just try and get a few of those little things done each day or each week? Do you do them after lunch when you're kind of tired and probably not good for too much else anyway? Just like knock a few out, figuring out your own rhythms, your own energy, what works for you in terms of keeping track of stuff. Organization, executive function, all of that is very different for different people. It's very different for different brains. And it's a lot easier for some people than others. So that's another whole side of this conversation that, is really important to be sensitive to, I think, and that is really going to differ from one person to another in terms of what the actual strategies are. That, like, does just having a to-do list and knocking things off of it work for you? Because for some people it does. For some people it's like, okay, I'm going to do the big picture things in the morning. I'm going to knock a few little silly little tasks out, in the afternoon, and then I know I have to do whatever, some like childcare and domestic stuff in the evening or something like that. And that works really well for some people. For some people, that is not going to work. Their attention is not going to be that focused, and they're going to have a completely different routine and learn completely different tactics that work for them, and the
Yeah.
way that their brain works. So there is no one size fits all. And it's disingenuous to say, like, oh, do this, do that. But I think that's where offering as many strategies as possible in a book, in a podcast, in any kind of ongoing conversation, you want lots of options. You want the ice cream store that has as many flavors of ice cream as you can, because only certain flavors are going to work for any particular individual.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up. I kind of feel like, yeah, bevy of tools. Only you know what's going to fit your life and your lifestyle and your brain and your capacity. And it's like
And it
tools over
changes. It changes
rules.
over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
You're like, when you set your capacity, like, what works for you now. And you said, like, we're both now self-employed. What works for you when you're self-employed is really different than what works for you when you're working a corporate job or for an employer. Life circumstances change as well. If you're caring for like aging parents, that's another major life stage that changes things. So you
And
have to be
and
really responsive in the tools and advice that are put forth, because some things I think are helpful to know. It's always helpful to have more information and know more things, but it's never going to be. I'm very, very suspicious of anyone who's offering like one simple trick, like it's
oh
just,
yeah, I'm with you.
it's
There's no
never,
one size fits all. No
mm.
one size fits all for sure. I echo that. I know we're coming up on time, but just because of everything we're talking about, and I think people like to see examples because they're like, oh, can you tell us in your own journey of, creating this agency in your life for doing the things you want to do and changing your relationship with time? What's one thing you're glad you stopped doing?
Well, I think for me, one of the biggest things, I think I'm going to kind of like talk my way into this a little bit, but like I have always been very firm on like work-life balance and on boundaries between work and life. Like I've always been like, I leave work at this time. I don't work evenings and weekends. Like I've always been very good about that. And, not checking work email at home, that kind of thing. Like I have a very good hygiene about that. So that isn't my example. Like it's not like I had to learn how to stop doing that, because that's just something that I've always kind of maintained for a long time. But what I think it took me a long time to realize is I really, really strongly don't like working in my home. And I always felt like being given the opportunity to work at home, like this is like pre-pandemic, like you could work from home on Fridays, you could work occasionally from home. It was sort of this rare thing that was meant to be very useful and helpful, especially like as an editor, you need quiet. You need like head down time where you're not being interrupted by like other people coming to talk to you or whatever. Like you really do need some alone time. And it took me a long time to realize like I don't want to work in my house. An extension of that sort of hygiene. Whereas like I want my house to be my house. I want that space to be for my family and for me. Like if I'm in my house, I get tempted to take a shower, do some laundry, make a sandwich, like do domestic things. The house is for house things and work is for work things. And I like to keep them separate. But it took me a really long time to understand that it doesn't initially sound like a time thing, but it kind of is, because I think time and space are very connected, that you tend to say like, I spend this time in this space, I spend this time in this space. Each has its own flavor. I like to be able to separate different times spent in different places and use them for different purposes. And I think that's how my brain works. I associate, different times and places and spaces. And if each one has kind of its own meaning for me, then it helps me to be more focused on what I'm doing in each one, more present with my family at home, more present in my work when I'm working. And so when I went freelance, I figured out how to manage to have a small office that is not in my home. So it's the kind of thing, to your point, where it's not so much that I was engaging in some really like terrible time practice, but more just really kind of going down inside yourself and figuring out those weird things about you that no one's going to tell you because they're just weird. They're just quirky. No one in society is going to explain that to you because it's just an individual quirk, but it does actually make a substantive difference in like your happiness, I think, once you've
Yeah.
unlocked like a little piece of your code. It's like, oh, I feel better when I do this than when I do that.
I'm glad that you shared that example because I think it's becoming quite common for people to have flexible work and it's not always the blessing that it's chalked up to. So I appreciate
Yeah,
the
I mean,
honesty.
I even found like when there was a time period as we were sort of coming out of lockdown, coming out of the pandemic, there was this time period where we could go into the office if we wanted to when I was still working an office job, but most people were working from home. I think we had to go into the office one day a week or something like that. But like most people chose to still work from home. I actually found myself going into the empty office most days and working by myself in an office building that had no people in it for this reason, because I was starting to figure out like, oh, I don't like working in my house. I want to get out of the
Yeah.
house. I like to commute. I like to go to a different place. And it was like me and like two other people who obviously felt the same way were showing
Yeah.
up to work every day. And we were just the oddballs, we just happened to have that preference. It's just a weird personal preference.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I always end my shows with a chance for reflection. So, based on that example, in terms of being self connected and self honoring and being open with our relationship to time, what's one question women could be asking themselves more?
I think it would be, what do you want to be spending time on that you are not currently spending time on?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bridget. That's a beautiful place to leave. Where can we find you and support your work and learn more?
Probably my favorite place right now is my Substack, which is Bridget Watson Payne at Substack. And yeah, I'm really enjoying it over there. I'm also on Instagram at Watson Payne. Yeah, I'm around.
All right. We'll make sure to capture that in the show notes. Thank you so much for sharing your time and energy today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great fun.
I'm so glad you joined me today. If you're looking for more, feel free to connect with me on Instagram at @WhitneyWoman. And if you enjoyed the show, I invite you to support me by leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Hope you have an inspired day.